Welcome to Future Sense Now, where we explore the landscape and byways of our shared futures. An e-zine of the Futures Forum live online. We exchange ideas, information, and inspiration about the futures we want. Get Future Sense Now with host Dr. Claire Nelson, futurist and editor of Human Futures.
Greetings and welcome to Future Sense Now, an online e-magazine of the Futures Forum. We are live online. Yes, it is March 2020, and we're celebrating Women's History Month with an exploration into the future history of women, Women 2030 and beyond. Why 2030? Well, by now we all should know that the United Nations agenda has 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and SDG 5 speaks specifically to the development and inclusion of women. This year's hashtag is hashtag each for equal. So the idea of equality and moving into new levels of equality following the 25 years since Beijing. So what might we expect for the future history of women? In particular, I want to explore what might this mean for women's excursion into the space age, or the race for space, which is heating up. I'd like to introduce this segment's guest, and her name is Laura Montgomery. She teaches space law at Catholic University's Columbus School of Law, and in her private practice, which is called she specializes in regulatory space law with an emphasis on commercial space transportation and the outer space treaties. And this is precisely why I'm excited to speak to her, because the outer space treaties did not contemplate the type of technology that has happened. Moreover, and more importantly, in her long and storied career, she has spent more than 2 decades with the Federal Aviation Administration, doing all sorts of things in this area, and has done a lot of work in actually writing the regulation by which we're now living. But even more importantly, I want to talk about the one thing that I find fascinating. She is a writer of science fiction about space, and that is going to certainly inform our thinking, I hope, about how women might emerge in the space age of 2040 and beyond. Without further ado, I want to say welcome and thank you very much, Laura Montgomery, for coming on us and beginning to talk to us about your work, and especially your new book, Mercenary Calling, right? Is that it? Yes. Thank you. How are you?
Good. Thank you, Claire. I really appreciate you having me on. I always enjoy talking about space law and science fiction. So it's a real pleasure to be meeting with you today.
Yes, so you heard me say, I know you don't follow this UN stuff that I'm crazy about too much, but I'm excited to talk to you about, because you're at the forefront of shaping the future we're living. I mean, your work in writing space law, in writing regulations about things like the permitting of space flight and space flight trajectories. I mean, it's like very, cosmological stuff. I think it's important to us as we think about women's role and this idea of each for equal and equal access to the future in space. So I want to ask you, as we jump into 2030 and you think about how the work you've been doing in space law informs where we're going, where are you thinking we might be as a human species in 2030 and the space conversation?
Well, I hope that by 2030 we have seen a lot of privatization, and that this will result in a much more democratic approach to space, because lots of people should be able to go. I think we see early stirrings of space tourism right now with the plans of Virgin Galactic, Blue Origin, and SpaceX to take people who are not government employees to space. And I think this is kind of a great step forward for all of us who are not government astronauts. We're going to see more innovation. I think the profit-making motive is a great spur to ingenuity, and maybe some of the problems of getting to outer space will be solved. So I am hopeful on many fronts that we'll be seeing some really exciting new developments, and that people like you and me, if we can scrape together the money, get to go.
Well, that's the problem right there, scrape together the money. I'm going to come back to you on the privatization question, because I have a lot of concerns about that. But I want to first talk about your your being a woman in this space? And have you found yourself to be fully accepted? Have you found yourself to be, is there still an old boys club, or are women readily accepted in this conversation? Because the UN Outer Space Agency is concerned that women might be left behind. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I think that women have taken great strides in the aerospace industry. You have people like Gwen Shotwell running SpaceX. My own personal experience is that I know a whole lot of women space lawyers. I'd say we're about 50% of the people I know are women who are space lawyers. The other 50%, of course, are men. And I think it's gone very well for women. You know, this whole equality initiative has been in place for an awfully long time. And I'd say it's starting to bear fruit, especially in professional fields. I don't think it's a universal phenomenon that women are doing well, but I do think that there's tremendous opportunities for women in space law, and it's there. You just have to work hard and get it.
You know, I'm thinking about that because Katherine Johnson, that black woman that was the central feature of the movie Hidden Figures, just died at 101, and her story was suppressed, or ignored rather, for so many years. And certainly as a black female engineer, I remember weeping when I read that story, because in some ways I would say perhaps the space community has been a little bit more accepting of racial differences and gender differences, because to think if she was not there calculating that
in the first place,
actually, you know, we would not be here, you know. And so perhaps it might be instructive if we can maybe deconstruct or deconcoct what might have been the mindset of even those people in NASA in those early years that were more focused on the vision of this unattainable moonshot, and to see how the lessons from that, and you might even be a part of that, because you're going into a room to write law about something that is very, like, you know, cosmological. It's not really tangible to many people. And so you have to operate in a space of belief, if you will, a space of faith, and a space of moral, I'm using the word rightitude. No such word, I know. But how do you think that lens that has been employed so far and has helped us get to the stage of the space race, which still have what I call the idea of space for the common good being the dominant thought? How can we be sure to capture that in a way that we continue on that line?
Well, I think the answer is privatization. Otherwise, it will just be very slow going, government operations. And I think we can look to the internet for a good, strong parallel. You know, DARPA helped create this whole giant network system, but to really make it accessible to the entire world, as it were, and practically free, if you want to use it that way, it took the private sector. And when I say private sector, I mean it took millions of people just trying to do different things, trying and failing, trying and succeeding. And I think that when we get to the point where that can happen in space, we're going to see a flourishing along the lines of the internet. So I hope that, you know, the private sector, private investment, private money, and individuals working in their garages are all out there trying out their different ideas and letting the market decide. You know, the market is a great democratic activity. You know, we're all basically crowdsourcing whether someone's going to succeed or fail by voting with our pocketbooks. So it'll be pretty cool to see how that goes forward. And it'll be all of us working together rather than just, you know, certain people in the government who get to go.
You know, I would say I have mixed feelings about that. I'm quite concerned, if you will. And that probably has informed my own jump into the race for space. You know, I started out with my story about being the first Jamaican on the moon back in 2038, which always freaks people out when I start my speeches like that. But as you talk about this idea of a future, I'm also intrigued by the idea of the need to have a new type of leadership style. And I'm wondering if having more women in the room as space lawyers, as space engineers, as astronauts, as space marketers, space communications, whatever, I wonder if we are near the tipping point where, quote unquote, so-called female ways of decision making, which is quote unquote more consensus is required. It is said, I'm not sure if it's true, but it is said that women are more likely to listen more carefully. Women are more likely to bend if necessary to achieve the common good. I'm wondering if you think we're anywhere near the tipping point of women in the industry. You mentioned a few names, that we can have that impact on the leadership to ensure that the space race does not become a wild, wild west, but becomes a more, let's say, informed 21st century vision of a shared concept of abundance for everybody.
Well, I think that if we do take a more democratic approach rather than a government-centric approach, I think we are going to see that. You know, I'm not a gender expert or anything, so I don't know about the role of women as women. I mean, most of the women and men I know are equal parts good and bad, competitive and nurturing and all of that. So I think we'll certainly see it. I don't know that it's only going to come from women or not. And as for it being a wild, wild west, I think it's too hard for crazy people. I think space is super hard to get to. It's got lots of technical, financial, and legal challenges. I was at a conference in the summer where they were talking about lunar mining. And I came away very depressed, Claire, because they just talked about how the dust is a problem for machinery and, you know, it makes things stop working and how are we going to surmount this horrible problem? And they just kept talking about obstacle after obstacle. And I thought, oh my gosh, how is this going to happen? And so, you know, we're talking about people who are going to be thinking about making their machines work. I think as much as I love science fiction, I think one of the disservices that science fiction does is it makes us think that space is going to be nothing but conflict. Well, in fiction, you want conflict, you want an exciting story. But in real life, I think it's going to be so darn hard and it's so big out there that people can go to different places and avoid conflict. So I have real hopes for the future of humanity. I don't know that it's gender specific either way. So I'm pretty darn hopeful.
You know, it's interesting you say it's not, you don't know it's gender specific, and perhaps because of your experience, as you say, you have found this space law community to be much more open to, I would say, a rational way of being. I'm using the word rational way of being because really it's rational to have both sides of the brain working. Some of us are kind of like that. I think you're like that in the sense that on the one hand, you're very creative, you make up stuff as you go along with your books. And then on the other hand, you have to focus on what the fact is, what precedent is, what, you know, what discovery is in law. And you said something that strikes something that I am concerned about, this idea that science fiction makes us think about the dark side of everything. And perhaps much of my fear comes from the lack of stories that have what I call a normatopian future. It's not going to be, oh, we're going to sing Kumbaya together. That's not going to happen. But why do we have to have all these stories that never present like a normal future with normal, you know, conflicts, quote unquote, where the world is not dark? In your storytelling, tell me a little bit more mercenary calling. Is it a story that allows us to see what I call a normal future with people just going about their lives, but there's tension, but there's not like this dark world?
Yes. Well, I know what you're talking about. There is a real tendency towards creating, you know, dystopian futures that, you know, lone heroic individuals have to struggle against. But I think that life is full of struggle. And in my own fiction, I try to, you know, strive for nobility and hope and courage rather than saying it's all terrible. And I do not try to depict mankind as awful. I think that humanity has a lot of good in it, just as it has a tremendous amount of bad. But so my book, Mercenary Calling, is about a lawyer who works for the Department of Energy, and he's around when the first interstellar starship comes back. Now, humanity sent this starship out during a time of a great asteroid threat to Earth. And so it's been gone for decades, and it finally comes back, and everyone's kind of forgotten about it. But it has found a new world that is very much like Earth. And the starship left a small settlement of people behind. And our hero, the space lawyer, of course, winds up representing the starship captain who is charged with leaving an illegal settlement. And so I think that part of the interest people have in space is they want to protect Earth. They want to see people have new frontiers and go visit new places and try new things. And here we have, you know, the tension in my story is about wanting to control things versus wanting to let life expand and grow and travel out and meet the future, or whether we're going to stop it. So it's a normal bourgeois setting. It's set in future Washington 100 years from now.
Yeah.
And, you know, everyone's pretty middle class, I would say. And,
And but is the hero, is the spaceship captain a woman? Is she Captain J?
yes, the starship captain is a woman. So she's, you know, so she's the client. She's got a really central role in all of this. And you know, the lawyer has to protect her interests and keep her from going to jail. So it's a good, I think it's a good balance, and I think it's full of hope. So I like reading fiction that has hope, even though I like being scared. So
well, actually, I'm very excited that you chose to make your quote unquote your potential criminal alleged lawbreaker, rule breaker, a woman. I think that's a good thing, because as you said, this kind of storytelling and story making, and I really want to see this kind of storytelling grow and be more visible, really offers us a different lens of how we might get to this type of thriving. Because I like to think of the next, let's say, 20 years of the human experiment as very dangerous, shocky, rocky shows. I think it's been always like this, and I beg to differ. I don't think it's always like this, because yes, we have had crises of different world wars, etc., but we never had a world war before where we had the capability to actually nuclearize everybody, you know, shoot us all out into space. We've never had kind of space where now we have a pandemic that's upon us that we're trying to deal with. Oh my God, how are we going to deal with this virus? Because planes are traveling, all trade might be slowed down. So there's a lot of things that we have to work out in this current space. What is it that keeps you up at night in the space community? What are some of the things that you might have been working on? Not the things that you can't disclose, obviously, but what can you disclose about what keeps you up at night as you think about our law being prepared for the technological realities of going into space?
Well, I think one thing that would benefit from a bit more certainty is the question of property rights. I categorize property rights in space in two ways. One is the extraction of resources, or mining, and we don't call it mining so much because people want to get water and minerals and all sorts of things. But so there's extracted resources. And then there's also the question of ownership of land. And in the United States, we have resolved the first question, because in 2015, Congress passed a law saying that if you mine it, you own it. Just like, you know, fishermen pulling fishes from the sea, even though the ocean is a global commons, if you catch the fish, they're yours. On the question of land, however, the Outer Space Treaty, Article 2, talks about a prohibition on nation states claiming sovereignty over celestial bodies such as the moon or Mars, or, you know, any other planets in the solar system. And a lot of people read that in combination with another provision to say that this also prohibits commercial appropriation of land. And I think that's a bad interpretation as a lawyer, but I also think that as someone who's very interested in humanity making it to space, that it has a very negative policy impact, because property rights are basically the cornerstone of wealth creation. If you read, you know, the South American economist De Soto, he makes this point very strongly. And you need to have title in land in order to mortgage it, in order to leverage it for as collateral to get future investment. And so when you don't have this certainty that you can plan because this is your land forever, it makes it hard to say I should invest. And then the funding dries up and nothing happens. So I think that if there was someone willing in the Congress to remove the uncertainty about the interpretation of Article 2, that I think would be hugely helpful to the future of space exploration and would be a good legal step in jumpstarting the space economy.
But I think we have to really look at it from a different perspective, because I think when you look at space, I see it as a thing that's available for all humanity. So when you talk about, so I think the first one I don't have too much of a problem with in terms of, okay, they got up there, they're minded, so therefore they have the right to take it. But then we have to put in place some whatever clauses that there is that might, whatever that could be, whatever quote unquote impact assessment, what is of today's character. But this idea of ownership, I think we have to spend more time as a human family, really making a sense, a proper scenario, if you will, of that 100-year or the 200-year vision of what that future could look like if ownership becomes a part of celestial bodies that actually affect our life here on Earth. Because I mean, the moon is not just up there doing nothing. It actually is supporting our life. You know, it blocks the sun from toasting us. It provides our tides, etc. So there has to be some way to see what are they. In fact, I'm writing an article about geoethics for a book that's coming out. I have to finish my article by, I think my deadline is like November the 30th. So I'm doing research now. But and I propose that we have to include in geoethics of today, not geoethics just of the Earth body, but of the solar body that we're now exploring as part of a relationship to Earth. And so I'm really looking at this question is, what can we learn from our experience having brought Earth to this very dangerous position where it's about to like throw us off like the cockroaches we are and say, to hell with you all humans, you made a mess of things. What can we learn from this and say, okay, is there another way? Is there a third way that we can borrow from, let's say, indigenous peoples who give personhood to the Earth, who give personhood then to the moon and other asteroids, and then say, okay, rather than somebody owning a piece of the moon, they have the right to use this part of it, but the benefit of that doesn't go to one state or one country, but goes into some, let's say, Earth Global Fund that then goes back to support, quote unquote, what you call ground-based space matters in that sense. You know what I mean? So it's not that this money that is being paid to these funds, like a sovereign wealth fund, in other words, the way that the oil companies give a sovereign wealth fund to countries that are poor, which some of them have stolen money, so let's not go there. But in the same way that there's a sovereign wealth fund, can we have like a global sovereign wealth fund that says, okay, we're going to have some, just like how we have UN agencies, a global agency that decides based on feasibility, which company gets the right to say mine a particular part of the moon or an asteroid, and then that fund is not paid to one country, it's paid to this global sovereign fund that then goes back into supporting the global agenda, because that's where we are now. We have to get to the stage where we recognize that this beautiful blue marble hurtling through space is our collective home, and we have to get more of us thinking that we are one family, we're one body politic, we're one body biome. So I guess I'm asking you as a lawyer to kind of help me think with that, not necessarily right now, but do you think that we can begin to have these kind of conversations? Should this be the time now before it gets set in stone that we have minds from different parts of the world coming together to have a conversation about what this might look like? Because the outer space treaty will have to be adopted, whatever, revised, whatever, reinvented, reimagined, reconciled, whatever. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, you said a lot here. I started taking notes so I could keep track of it all. But one thing, just as a legal matter, space itself is not a global commons like the oceans are under the Outer Space Treaty. What it makes clear is that the exploration and use of outer space is open to everyone. So it's really big out there. The moon is not only bigger than the United States, it's bigger than Texas. So, there's a lot of room. And I think that we don't need to worry about people, certainly for the next couple centuries, using it all up. I think that it's way bigger than that. And that what we want to do is encourage people. And so that those who do the work get rewarded rather than taxed to death, which I think this global fund notion probably has. And just for your own peace of mind, this is definitely a conversation that has been going on for decades as to whether there should be a global fund, private property, all of that. Now, as someone who does not think that humanity is a set of cockroaches, but that we are filled with just as much a spark of the divine as any other creature, and that we are capable, just as we're capable of great terribleness, we are capable of great beauty and good. And so I don't really think that we need to change our fundamental nature. And I think that one of the things that people respond to is rewards and incentives. And that when you tell someone who's just spent decades of her life working to get to outer space, mortgaged her house, and is actually finally got, her robots mining the moon, and then you tell her that that's not hers, I don't see that encouraging other people to do something similar. So I'm not a fan of the Global Fund, and officially the United States did not sign the Moon Treaty in which a global fund would have been created. Mm-hmm. So the Moon Treaty is not in operation for most of the spacefaring nations. I think Australia has signed it, but it is something that I, as a policy matter, don't see as productive or encouraging of outer space. I think that, as people from different countries go to outer space, they will get taxed by their governments, and the governments will do with the tax money what they always do: waste some of it, spend some of it on good things, and muddle along. But I think creating a global fund administered by just a few people is a much worse solution than creating a dynamic market economy where everyone gets a say in whether something succeeds or fails on a voluntary basis, as opposed to through the force of government.
Interesting. I have to give that some more thought.
I worry about the tragedy of the commons.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that happens when something belongs to no one or everyone, which really means no one, is that it gets polluted. It doesn't get cared for. We all take much better care of our own houses and land than we seem to, as a collective, to take care of the oceans. They're filled with plastic. Fish, marine life gets depleted. That's because no one owns it and husbands it properly. So I think that collective ownership results in scarcity and want. And I'm much more of a fan of private ownership as a policy matter myself.
Yeah, I think we're going to have a lot more, not in this conversation, a lot more conversation on this, because from the point of view of, let's say, myself, someone coming from a country which has been colonized, oppressed, enslaved, we see the world very differently. And so now that we have a global space in which to have these conversations, and quite frankly, this year, for example, a Caribbean island will be on this UN Security Council. And I'm certainly pushing that Prime Minister to have a conversation about this, because at some point, we're talking about 5G and 6G and satellite communications dominating the space. We have to have a conversation about what this would look like, not in our lifetime, but like your book is set 100 years from now. What do the decisions we make now, how can we make better decisions? Because decisions that were made 40 years ago, some of us are now paying the price for that. So we don't want to repeat those mistakes. And I think the lessons that you have learned, and certainly the knowledge that you have, will be very instructive in a conversation like that, because you have a very fixed idea based on your reality. And I think it's very good, because I hadn't thought about that aspect of it, that the commons, nobody will take care of it. So so there's a weakness in my approach. There's a weakness in your approach. So how can we, as rational beings, wanting the best, we want the same thing, we want to go to space, we want to have people have the ability to invent and create more beautiful things like what we're doing now, but how do we make less mistakes? So as we come to a close, are you optimistic, pessimistic, or neutralistic when you think about your story? Back to mercenary calling, and you can imagine, because you know so much more, what is happening now behind the scenes, that this is actually, looking like it's going to move forward. Are you optimistic, pessimistic, or neutralistic that a story like what you're talking about could really, if we're around to see it, even in the transhumanist movement, as a transhuman person, we're around to see some of it. What are you thinking you might see? How you feel about that?
Well, I think that we could see some of these developments, because in the world of mercenary calling, we have reached the moon, we have settlements on Mars, and then we send a starship to another solar system, which, whether it will find an exact replica of Earth, I think is a little fictional on my part, but it's a good story, so I went with
Why
it.
not?
Right.
I want
I am
to.
hopeful, and I think there's lots of people working to make that happen. Lots of people approach space with not a search to conquer, but with a search to explore and to find new places to live and new places to go and see. As a human race, a frontier is always a good thing. We evolved going over the next hill, and so here's the next hill. I say we climb it.
I just love that. As a Star Trek person, I think I was first enthralled by this notion myself. So I really believe in the Star Trek version. Even though people say, well, it's very Earth-centered. Well, yeah, that's all we know, right? So we're going to be human-centered and Earth-centered, what we know. But it really, to me at least, it laid the groundwork for a new way of us seeing ourselves, not as conquerors. I think Space Trek did actually lay that down for us in that way. And I'm really happy about that, because I think many of the people now involved in the space movement do think like that. To sum up, if you had to write a headline based on the books that you're writing and what you know, or based on your space law books more so than your fantasy books, give me, in 10 years, give me an aspiration headline of what you would like to see.
I would like to see a headline that says someone has figured out how to start deorbiting space junk safely. I think that would be a great headline to see in 10 years. And they've accomplished it, and they've started the job.
Why is that? We didn't get a chance about why is that?
Oh, because there is a lot of space junk in orbit. And it interferes with normal operations. And it would be very nice to get it cleaned up and out of the way. And so I actually wrote a novel about that called Manx Prize, where
slow it down. What's the book called? Because I would like to read it. What is it called, the book?
Manx Prize, MANX, because the Isle of Man in my story has a satellite association that offers a prize of $50 million for whoever can first figure out how to deorbit large pieces of debris. So the whole story is about the race to be first. And so I think that figuring out how to clean up orbital debris would be great. And I'd love to see that headline in 10 years.
And I would love to see it, especially if, given that's some of your passion of yours, given that you're a writer, given that you're a space lawyer, I would love to see the headline included. And Laura Montgomery, whose company Groundbased Space Matters was a part of the team that made it happen. That would be so nice. I'm serious, because we really have to do that. I just want to say thank you so much for being with me and opening my ears and my eyes to so many new ways of seeing. Thank you, Laura Montgomery.
Well, thank you, Claire. I loved being here.
Yeah, friends, we have come to the end of a very exciting conversation with Laura Montgomery. She is a private practitioner. Her company is called Groundbased Space Matters. She's an author. You heard about 2 books, Manx Prize and Mercenary Calling. Please go online, look her up, Laura Montgomery, and just know that this is one of the people who is indeed shaping the future, even though she's no longer, quote unquote, with the big boy. She's doing it on her own. We want to thank you for joining us on Future Sense Now, where we explore salient ideas for sustainable futures. We know that creating the future we want is our shared responsibility, and we remember it is better for us to act as a parent of our future than a child of our past. So, as we say in Jamaica, walk good and safe journeys.
Thank you for listening to Future Sense Now with Dr. Claire Nelson. Future Sense Now is produced by the Futures Forum in Washington, D.C. For more information, visit www.thefuturesforum.org. Remember, our futures are embedded in the landscape of our present stories. Seize the day, share this story, and share the future.